So our first snippet for this week looks at what we would now call culture issues, which emerge with a kind of ferocity in the 1920s and early 1930s and intrude on legal matters. The first was broadly defined xenophobia, which manifested itself in a variety of different ways, but in particular with a strong impetus for immigration restriction. Remember, we've looked previously in this course at the Chinese exclusion legislation of the 1880s, but until World War One, the only kind of immigration exclusions that existed in U.S. law targeted Asian immigrants. But after the war, this is extended more broadly. Partially, this is due to ideological reasons. There's a fear that immigrants are bringing in unwanted ideas to the United States. You can kind of get a sense of it from this cartoon. During World War One, as some of you may know from earlier history classes, you have all of these weird situations where state legislatures ban uh, German instruction. Sauerkraut is renamed Liberty Cabbage. Orchestras cease playing Bach and Beethoven, and the idea is that inculcating Americans with German ideas would cause national security problems. But one of these cases, which is a case from Nebraska, eventually works its way up to the Supreme Court. And the issue here was that the state of Nebraska had passed a law forbidding the instruction of German as a foreign language in schools. And the idea was that if little kids learned German, that would impose on them militaristic ideas. It's kind of odd argument. And in Meyer, the court rejects this. Intriguingly, they reject it on grounds that this is harmful to the job prospects of teachers who teach in German. Violates the due process clause. The court argues because it's essentially an irrational bowing to prejudice. This is part of a broader shift with regards to immigration, and so this sort of nationalist ideology, sort of increasingly creates a sense that Americanness is being undermined, and part of the concern here, and you can kind of see from these pie charts, is that the nature of American immigration from Europe is changing. Beginning in the last decade of the 19th century and then the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the majority of immigrants to the U.S. are coming from Southern or Eastern Europe. So these are Italians, East Europeans, Russians, significant number of Jewish immigrants during this period. And there's a concern that these people tend to be too radical, that they're not assimilating into the United States, and there's pressure to enact a formalized system of immigration restriction, which the United States does on a temporary basis in 1921 and a permanent basis in 1924. And intriguingly, this 1924 law uses the census of 1890 rather than more recent figures to establish quotas from each country that can send a certain number of immigrants. So basically, the goal is to shift U.S. immigration back towards an immigration based on people from Northern and Western Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, England, rather than Southern and Eastern Europe. This has horrific consequences in the run up to World War II, as Jewish refugees are in large numbers are barred from the United States. But again, this is part of a kind of xenophobic attitude, and all of these come together: a kind of nationalism, a fear of radicalism, a sense that Southern and Eastern Europeans are not American, with the Sacco and Vanzetti case, which is one of a series of these trials of the century. There were a number of such trials in the 1920s. These are Italian anarchists who are accused of murder, very possibly may have been guilty, but are also found guilty after just incredibly biased trial. The judge is sort of conspiring with the prosecution. I mean, obvious constitutional violations in how it's handled. Their cases appeal to the governor of Massachusetts. The governor consults faculty and administrators from Harvard. Eventually, the decision is to allow their execution to go ahead. This becomes an international cause celeb in the sense that the United States is this backwater country that's executing people because of their political beliefs. But it's part of this broader xenophobic surge. It's not just xenophobia that we see in the 1920s. This is the NAACP blots of shame map. Lynching continues throughout the 20s, and you can see where it's targeting primarily in the South. Federal anti-lynching legislation becomes a chief priority of the NAACP. It's first introduced in 1922. It's called the Dire Anti-Lynching Act. The problem here is that in these southern jurisdictions, when a Black person is lynched, this is obviously it's a murder, but local prosecutors are generally unwilling to try the parties, and so the NAACP wants a federal law to make lynching a federal crime, so U.S. attorneys, not people who are subject to political pressure in the South, could bring charges. You can read the text of the statute on the screen. This never gets enacted, and indeed it is subjected to one of the early effective filibusters. This idea that debate will just go on in the Senate unless two-thirds of the members of the Senate vote to close off debate and move to vote on the bill. You can see that the Dire Anti-Lynching bill, which goes through a number of different forms, eventually gets passed in the House, but is blocked in the Senate in the 1930s, and indeed can never even get majority support in the Senate. So, in theory, yes, this is a measure which is killed by the filibuster. But even if there had been an up or down vote, it can't get majority support there. Another aspect of kind of the culture war approach comes in these statutes that ban the teaching of evolution in public schools. This includes universities. This is the statute that I have here is from Tennessee. Most of these laws are passed in southern or western states where a kind of conservative brand of Christianity is very strong. There's this sense that the culture is changing, and Christians need to sort of involve themselves in politics to resist these changes. This law was challenged in an act of civil disobedience by this man, John Scopes, a biology teacher. He teaches evolution in class. He knows he's going to get punished for this. He's fined for the result, and then he appeals. He goes to trial, and the trial becomes the latest of the trials of the century. This is the Scopes monkey trial. Clarence Darrow, probably the most famous defense lawyer of the day, comes in to represent Scopes, and his goal at trial is to put the law on trial, basically to defend Scopes by saying this is a crazy law. The local prosecutor is intimidated by Darrow, doesn't really want to go up against him in the courtroom, and reaches out to William Jennings Bryan, three-time Democratic presidential candidate, a deeply conservative in terms of doctrine Christian, who sort of drifts to the right near the end of his career, and he's near death at this point. But he comes in and acts as a special prosecutor. And the highlight of the trial, one of the more famous events in American legal history, is when Darrow calls for the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, to serve as an expert witness. The argument that Bryan based his defense of the law on was that the Bible should be seen as a statement of literal facts, and therefore, since the Bible says that evolution didn't occur, it's perfectly reasonable for the Tennessee legislature to accept that as factual. And so Darrow says he wants to call Bryan to the stand as an expert in the Bible to determine whether everything in the Bible is literally true. Bryan shouldn't have gone to the stand. He does. Darrow, sort of goes through biblical stories. The and basically makes Bryan look like a fool. I mean, the Bible is not a literal recapitulation of events. And even though at the end of the day, Scopes is found guilty, the national media attention makes this Tennessee law look like there's a backlash against it, and there's a movement towards a more secular approach. And then the last of the big cultural issues during the 1920s comes with the aftermath of Prohibition. And you see this surge of activity of the federal government coming in and seizing liquor and beer under the Volstead Act. So the Volstead Act was the implementation legislation for Prohibition, with a rise in arrests as well. But Prohibition, I think, as we all know, it's irregularly enforced in many of the northern states. It helps to stimulate a wave of organized crime where people can purchase, alcohol, but they do so from criminals. Al Capone is among the most famous of these. And by the early 1930s, it's clear that the Prohibition experiment has been a failure. So that's our first snippet looking at these kind of culture war controversies during the 1920s.